The city did not fall in a single moment. It tightened slowly, supply by supply, road by road, decision by decision. By the time the people of Zhongdu understood what was happening, the collapse had already begun, not with fire, not with walls breaking, but with silence where movement used to be. Trade caravans stopped arriving. Grain convoys disappeared. Messengers failed to return. And beyond the horizon, where the northern plains stretched into distance, something had changed. The Mongols were not coming. They were already there. At the beginning of the 13th century, the Jin Dynasty stood as one of the most powerful states in East Asia. Its capital, Zhongdu, located in what is now modern Beijing, was not just a political center. It was a symbol of stability, a fortified city, surrounded by thick defensive walls, supported by administrative order, agricultural supply systems, and a military structure designed to repel nomadic threats from the north. For generations, those threats had been predictable. Steppe tribes raided. They moved quickly. They avoided prolonged engagements. They struck border regions, seized resources, and withdrew before organized resistance could respond. The Jin military had adapted to this pattern. Their strategy was defensive, structured, and rooted in the assumption that their enemy would behave as it always had. That assumption would become their first vulnerability, because the Mongols did not behave as expected. Genghis Khan did not inherit a unified empire. He built one through a series of calculated decisions that reshaped the political structure of the steppe. Before his rise, Mongol tribes were divided by loyalty, bloodline, and shifting alliances. Authority was unstable. Power was temporary. Conflict was constant. Survival depended on immediate advantage, not long-term coordination. Genghis Khan changed that system. He replaced tribal loyalty with centralized command. Leaders were chosen based on effectiveness, not lineage. Units were reorganized into decimal structures, groups of 10, 100, 1,000, designed for flexibility and discipline. Orders could be transmitted across vast distances without confusion. Retreats were not collapses. They were maneuvers. This was not just a military reform. It was a transformation of how war itself was conducted. The Jin Dynasty did not immediately recognize the scale of that transformation. To them, the Mongols were another northern threat, larger, perhaps more aggressive, but ultimately governed by the same limitations that had defined steppe warfare for centuries. They believed mobility came at the cost of sustainability. That belief shaped their response. Instead of preparing for a prolonged strategic confrontation, the Jin focused on reinforcing strongholds, securing defensive positions, and maintaining control over key urban centers. Zhongdu, with its walls and internal resources, was considered secure, but the Mongols were not attempting to break the walls. They were studying everything around them. By the time Mongol forces began advancing into Jin territory, their objectives were already structured around something deeper than territorial expansion. They were targeting systems, supply routes, communication lines, regional dependencies. Instead of concentrating force against the capital, they fragmented the surrounding regions. Towns were isolated. Garrisons were separated from command structures. Reinforcements were intercepted before they could converge. The effect was gradual, but irreversible. Zhongdu remained standing, but its connections to the outside world were weakening. Inside the Jin court, the situation was interpreted differently. Reports arrived, but they were inconsistent. Some described Mongol raids. Others described large-scale movements. Communication delays distorted the timeline. By the time information reached decision-makers, it was already outdated. This created uncertainty, and uncertainty produced hesitation. The Jin leadership faced a decision: commit forces to open confrontation against a mobile enemy or maintain defensive posture and protect the capital. They chose defense. It was a rational decision based on their understanding of warfare, but it assumed that time was neutral. It was not. Time was being used against them. Genghis Khan did not rush the siege of Zhongdu. He did not need to. Every day that passed without decisive engagement was a day in which Jin resources were consumed, morale was tested, and control of the surrounding territory diminished. The Mongol army moved with intention, but not urgency. They encircled without appearing to fully surround. They attacked where resistance was weakest, then withdrew before counterattacks could be organized. They forced the Jin to react, to spread their forces thin across multiple fronts. This created a pattern, one that appeared chaotic from the outside, but was, in reality, controlled. The Jin military began deploying forces outward, to stabilize regions, to reopen supply lines, to push Mongol units back from key routes. Each deployment weakened the concentration of defense around Zhongdu. Each attempt to regain control created new vulnerabilities elsewhere, and the Mongols observed every movement. They learned how quickly Jin forces responded, where reinforcements originated, which routes were prioritized, which commanders reacted aggressively, and which hesitated. This was not reconnaissance in the traditional sense. It was analysis, a systematic process of identifying pressure points. Beyond the battlefield, the psychological impact began to take shape. For Jin soldiers, the enemy was increasingly difficult to define. The Mongols did not engage in predictable formations. They appeared, attacked, and disappeared. Their movements suggested coordination, but their tactics resembled fragmentation. This contradiction created confusion. Were they retreating or repositioning? Were these isolated raids or part of a larger strategy? Without clear answers, confidence began to erode. And once uncertainty enters a military structure, it does not remain contained. It spreads, from the front lines to command. Within Zhongdu, the city remained operational. Markets functioned. Administrative duties continued. The walls stood intact. But the flow of resources had begun to change. Supplies that once arrived consistently were now delayed or missing entirely. Prices fluctuated. Storage systems were strained. Officials attempted to regulate distribution, but the underlying issue was not internal management. It was external control, and that control was slipping away. Genghis Khan understood something the Jin did not. A capital does not collapse when its walls fall. It collapses when its systems fail. Food, communication, coordination, these are not visible defenses, but they determine how long a city can sustain itself under pressure. The Mongol strategy was not designed to breach Zhongdu immediately. It was designed to make resistance unsustainable. As the months progressed, the Jin Dynasty faced a growing contradiction. They possessed a fortified capital. They maintained a standing army. They controlled a structured state. But their ability to project power beyond the city was diminishing. Each attempt to reclaim territory required resources that were becoming increasingly scarce. Each loss of a supply route compounded the difficulty of maintaining the next. The situation was not collapsing rapidly. It was tightening, and that made it harder to recognize. From the Mongol perspective, the campaign was proceeding as intended. There was no need for a decisive battle, no need for unnecessary risk. The objective was not to defeat the Jin in a single engagement, but to dismantle their ability to function as a unified state. Zhongdu was not just a target. It was the center of that system, and once it was isolated, everything else would follow. By the time the Jin court began to fully understand the nature of the threat, their options had already narrowed. They could attempt a large-scale offensive to break the encirclement and restore external control, or they could consolidate, preserve the capital, and endure the pressure. Both choices carried consequences. One risked immediate confrontation with an enemy whose tactics remained unclear. The other accepted a prolonged siege, under conditions that were steadily deteriorating. There was no neutral path, only decisions made under pressure. And beyond the walls, the Mongol forces continued their work, not with spectacle, but with precision. Roads remained blocked. Reinforcements remained intercepted. Movement remained restricted. No single action appeared decisive, but together they formed something more dangerous than assault. They formed control. The siege of Zhongdu had not yet reached its breaking point. The walls still stood. The city still functioned. But the balance had shifted, not in a moment of battle, but through a sequence of decisions, each one logical in isolation, but collectively leading toward a position from which recovery would become increasingly difficult. Because the Mongols were not trying to win quickly. They were ensuring that, when the final phase came, there would be nothing left to resist it. By the time the campaign around Zhongdu entered its decisive phase, The war no longer resembled a contest between two armies. It had become a contest between systems, one rigid, centralized, and increasingly strained, the other adaptive, decentralized, and expanding its control with every movement. But even within this imbalance, both sides still possessed a capacity to fight, and both understood that the next decisions would determine whether the siege would tighten or break. The Jin Dynasty's military was not weak. It was structured, experienced, and capable of organizing large formations. Its strength lay in its ability to defend fortified positions, coordinate infantry units, and deploy heavy cavalry where terrain allowed. Its officers were trained within a system that valued hierarchy, discipline, and control. But those strengths depended on stability, clear lines of communication, predictable supply, defined fronts. Around Zhongdu, none of those conditions fully existed anymore. Instead, Jin forces operated in fragments. Units dispatched to reopen routes, detachments assigned to reinforce outlying positions, and reserves held within the city to respond to threats that could not be precisely located. Commanders received incomplete information. Orders were issued based on reports that described situations already changed. By the time forces moved, the battlefield had shifted. This created a delay between decision and reality. And in war, delay is exposure. The Mongol army operated differently. Its structure was designed to function within uncertainty. Units could move independently while remaining part of a coordinated system. Communication relied on speed and simplicity, signals, relays, and predefined operational logic. Commanders were expected to adapt without waiting for direct instruction, as long as their actions aligned with broader objectives. This allowed the Mongols to maintain cohesion without central rigidity. They did not need to hold fixed positions. They needed to control movement. The terrain around Zhongdu played a critical role in this dynamic. To the north and west stretched open plains, ideal for cavalry maneuver. To the south and east, the landscape became more fragmented, intersected by roads, agricultural zones, and smaller settlements that supported the capital. These routes were not just pathways. They were lifelines. Every convoy, every messenger, every reinforcement passed through these corridors, and the Mongols positioned themselves along them, not as a static blockade, but as a shifting presence that could intercept, withdraw, and reappear elsewhere. This made the battlefield difficult to define. There was no single front line, only zones of pressure. Jin commanders attempted to impose structure onto this environment. They organized escort formations for supply convoys, heavily guarded, moving in coordinated groups. They deployed cavalry units to patrol key routes, attempting to detect Mongol movements before they could strike. They established temporary fortified positions along roads, creating nodes of resistance intended to secure passage. These measures were logical, but they assumed that the enemy would engage directly. The Mongols did not. Instead of attacking fortified convoys head-on, they targeted the conditions around them. They disrupted smaller movements, scouts, messengers, lightly guarded transports. They attacked at moments of vulnerability, when formations stretched during movement, when terrain restricted maneuverability, when communication between units faltered, and when resistance was strong, they withdrew, not as a retreat, but as a refusal to engage on unfavorable terms. This forced the Jin into a pattern of reaction. They could defend successfully in isolated encounters, but they could not prevent the accumulation of losses across the system. Within the Mongol command, this approach was not improvised. It was directed. Genghis Khan did not require constant oversight of individual engagements. His strategy established a framework: isolate the capital, fragment external support, maintain mobility, avoid unnecessary risk, and exploit every opportunity to weaken coordination. Sub-commanders executed within that framework. This created consistency. Even when operating across wide distances, Mongol units acted toward the same objective. As pressure increased, the Jin court faced mounting urgency. Reports from the countryside described loss of control. Outlying regions that once provided resources and manpower were no longer secure. Attempts to reassert authority required increasingly large deployments, which in turn strained the defenses of the capital. The question was no longer whether the Mongols were present. It was how to respond effectively to a threat that did not behave in a fixed pattern. A decision was made. Jin forces would conduct larger, more concentrated operations, offensives designed to push Mongol units away from key routes and re-establish a control perimeter around Zhongdu. This required coordination, multiple units moving simultaneously, attempting to compress Mongol movements and force engagement. For the Jin, this was a return to familiar doctrine, mass, structure, and direct confrontation. But the Mongols did not resist in the way expected. When Jin forces advanced in strength, Mongol units withdrew, drawing them outward, extending their lines, increasing the distance between coordinated elements. Then, as formation stretched and communication weakened, the Mongols re-engaged, not against the entire force, but against its edges, rear elements, flanks, isolated detachments. This fragmented the Jin advance. Units that began as part of a coordinated operation became separated, forced to react independently under pressure. And once separated, they were vulnerable. The psychological effect on Jin soldiers intensified. They faced an enemy that did not present itself as a stable target. Engagements were brief, violent, and often inconclusive. Victories did not lead to control. Defeats did not eliminate the threat. The absence of decisive battle created a sense of incompletion, a constant anticipation of the next encounter. Fatigue was not just physical, it was cognitive. Commanders could not rely on patterns. Soldiers could not predict outcomes. Each movement carried uncertainty, and uncertainty erodes confidence. Within Zhongdu, the strain became visible. Supplies were now irregular. Rationing systems were implemented. Administrative control tightened, but could not compensate for the reduction in incoming resources. The city remained intact, but its resilience depended on factors beyond its walls. And those factors were no longer secure. At the same time, Mongol operations began to shift. The isolation phase had achieved its objective. Zhongdu was not completely cut off, but it was no longer supported at the level required for sustained resistance. This created an opportunity, not for immediate assault, but for controlled escalation. Mongol forces began applying pressure closer to the capital, not in full-scale attacks, but in probing operations designed to test defenses, identify weak points, and further disrupt internal coordination. Outlying positions near Zhongdu were targeted. Garrisons that had once served as buffer zones were reduced or abandoned. This brought the Mongol presence closer, visible from the walls, audible in the distance. The threat was no longer abstract. It was immediate. Jin commanders within the city faced a narrowing set of options. They could remain defensive, preserving strength, maintaining order, and waiting for an opportunity to break the siege. Or they could attempt to break out, risking confrontation in an environment already shaped by Mongol control. Both options required clarity, but clarity was difficult to achieve because the battlefield did not present itself as a single, decisive moment. It presented itself as a series of pressures, each demanding response, each reducing flexibility. Genghis Khan's strategy did not force a single critical decision. It forced continuous decision-making under deteriorating conditions. And over time, that process becomes unsustainable. As Mongol units tightened their operational reach, the environment around Zhongdu changed. Movement became dangerous. Visibility decreased, not physically, but strategically. Jin forces could not determine where the next engagement would occur. Even within short distances of the city, control was uncertain. The space between safety and threat had collapsed. The stage was set for the next phase. Not a sudden escalation, but a shift in balance. The Jin Dynasty still possessed its capital, still maintained its army, still held its walls. But the conditions that allowed those advantages to function were no longer stable. The Mongols had not yet broken Zhongdu. They had done something more precise. They had made its defense increasingly difficult to sustain. And as the pressure continued to build, the final question began to take shape. Not whether the city could resist, but how long before resistance itself became impossible. The end did not arrive with a single breach. There was no sudden collapse of the walls, no moment where the defense simply failed. Instead, the turning point came quietly, when the Jin Dynasty lost the ability to choose how the war would continue. Inside Zhongdu, the signs had been accumulating. Food stores, once managed through controlled distribution, were no longer sufficient to maintain stability. Rations tightened, first gradually, then with visible urgency. What had once been precaution became necessity. Markets slowed, then fractured. Prices rose beyond regulation. Hoarding began not as defiance, but as instinct. Officials attempted to maintain order, but their authority depended on resources that no longer existed in reliable supply. The system had not collapsed, but it had begun to fail. For the soldiers stationed within the city, the nature of the conflict had changed. Earlier, they had prepared for battle. Now they endured waiting without clarity, without movement, without the ability to engage the enemy directly. Morale does not always break under violence. It erodes under uncertainty. Units remain organized. Command structures remain intact. But beneath that structure, confidence was diminishing. Orders were followed, but belief in their effectiveness weakened. This created a dangerous condition. An army that functions, but no longer trusts the outcome. Beyond the walls, the Mongol presence had become constant, not overwhelming, but unavoidable. Their movements were visible from the outskirts. Patrols extended closer to the city perimeter. Outlying resistance had been eliminated or absorbed. There were no longer zones of safety beyond the immediate defenses of Zhongdu. The capital was not fully surrounded, but it was fully contained. Within the Jin court, pressure intensified. The decision that had once been strategic, maintaining defense, was now constrained by necessity. The option of waiting had lost its advantage, but alternatives carried risk. A breakout required coordination, strength, and speed. It demanded a level of operational clarity that no longer existed. Forces within the city could be assembled, but their success depended on conditions outside the walls, conditions now shaped by Mongol control. Remaining defensive, however, guaranteed continued decline. There was no longer a stable path, only diminishing options. This was the point at which the nature of the siege shifted, not in tactics, but in consequence. The Mongols began increasing pressure, not through reckless assault, but through controlled intensification. Attacks became more frequent along the outer defenses. Testing actions escalated into sustained engagements. The objective was not immediate breakthrough, but acceleration of exhaustion. Each engagement forced the Jin to respond. Each response consumed resources, food, manpower, attention. And with every cycle, the margin for recovery narrowed. The Jin military still possessed discipline. They repelled assaults, maintained defensive positions, reinforced critical sections of the wall. From a distance, the structure of resistance remained intact, but the difference between holding and sustaining had become critical. Holding is immediate. Sustaining requires continuity, and continuity had been broken. At some point, no single date, no single order, the internal balance shifted. Commanders began prioritizing preservation over initiative. Units were repositioned not to expand control, but to prevent further loss. This was rational, but it signaled something deeper, the transition from active defense to managed decline. For the population within Zhongdu, the experience was less defined by strategy and more by absence. Absence of food, absence of reliable information, absence of movement. The city, once a center of administration and trade, had become isolated, functioning internally, but disconnected from the systems that had sustained it. Fear was present, but it was not explosive. It was gradual, a realization that the situation was not temporary. Genghis Khan did not need to force a decisive engagement. The structure he had created ensured that pressure would produce its own outcome. The Jin Dynasty had been placed in a position where every decision carried cost, and none restored control. This is the essence of the strategy, not destruction through force, but elimination of viable choices. When the final phase approached, it did not feel like a turning point. It felt like continuation. Mongol forces advanced closer to the city's defenses. Engagements intensified. Sections of the wall were targeted repeatedly, not for immediate breach, but to weaken resistance, to stretch defenders, to create openings through accumulated pressure. The Jin responded as they had throughout the siege, with organization, with discipline, with effort. But effort alone could not reverse the conditions. Eventually, the balance reached its limit, not in a moment of collapse, but in a point where continuation was no longer sustainable. The defense could not be maintained at the required level. Resources were insufficient. Coordination was strained. Morale had declined to a threshold where endurance could not compensate for systemic failure. At that point, the outcome was no longer uncertain. Only the timing remained. When Zhongdu fell in 1215, it was not simply the result of military defeat. It was a conclusion of a process that had begun long before the walls were threatened. A process defined by isolation, pressure, and the gradual dismantling of a system that had once appeared stable. For the Mongols, the capture of Zhongdu represented more than territorial gain. It demonstrated the effectiveness of a method, a way of conducting war that did not rely on singular victories, but on cumulative advantage, control over movement, disruption of systems, exploitation of decision-making under pressure. These principles would be applied repeatedly in future campaigns, and each time the result would be similar. Opponents would not always be defeated in battle. They would be rendered unable to continue. For the Jin Dynasty, the loss carried deeper consequences. Zhongdu had been more than a capital. It was a center of administration, logistics, and authority. Its fall disrupted not only military capability, but political cohesion. Recovery was possible, but would occur under conditions fundamentally altered by the loss. The dynasty would continue, but its position had changed. Irreversibly, the humiliation was not in the fall itself. Cities fall in war,